Bill, let's talk about the outcome of the midterm elections happening south of the border. Republicans have suggested there will be no blank check for Ukraine if they take back the House. Let's talk about the impact to what is happening in Ukraine right now. What does that mean?
Well, if you look at the situation in Ukraine, Ukraine has done so much better than anyone expected at the very beginning. Part of that is due to the Ukrainians' fierce defense of their freedom and their homeland, and part of it is due to the United States and other countries providing weapons and other financial aid. And if we look at the sort of overall pie chart of who's providing the financial aid, the huge majority of the financial aid is coming from the United States. And so whatever the United States decides to do has a deep and meaningful impact on how this war may end up. And so if the U.S. were to stop supporting Ukraine or limit the support of Ukraine, that could have a very material outcome. And that is Vladimir Putin's biggest hope, is that he can somehow use whatever influence, whatever hacking, whatever trolling, whatever operations he can put in place to stop the United States from helping Ukraine.
Do you believe that the U.S. would limit its support to Ukraine?
Well, Kevin McCarthy, who is very likely to become the next Speaker of the House of Representatives, has already said it. Now, he didn't say we're going to limit it or curtail it. He said no blank check. What does that mean? There are people in his party that are saying no money for Ukraine, and there are people in his party saying full support. And so the answer is going to be somewhere in the middle. I can only hope and pray that it's a lot closer to where we were before than the Marjorie Taylor Greene and pro-Putin wing of the Republican Party.
I understand that you've met with our Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland. Are you able to share anything from that meeting?
Well, it was a personal meeting, a private meeting, as a friend, because we've known each other for several decades, and so I can't share the details, but what I can say is that whatever we're probably going to discuss today was similar to the type of conversation that she and I had. It was all about Ukraine, where we are, where we're going, and what can be done.
Do you think what Canada has done has been enough? Can Canada do more?
Well, I can't comment specifically on Canada because Canada is a part of a much bigger consortium of countries. What I can say is that the Western Alliance, the United States, Canada, the EU, have done enough for Ukraine in terms of weapons to help make sure that Ukraine doesn't lose the war. But we have not done enough to help Ukraine win the war. And there's a very specific set of weapons that Ukraine has asked for that have been withheld by the Western Alliance, by the United States primarily, because there's this fear that we don't want to escalate the war. But that's kind of like effectively an appeasement strategy because Putin continues to escalate the war. The best way of stopping him escalating it is to end the war, and the best way to end the war is to give the Ukrainians enough tools to do it for themselves.
The U.S. has suggested that Ukraine should at least open the doors to negotiations or diplomatic talks.
Well, it's a complete nonsense to say negotiations and diplomatic talks. Russia has invaded Ukraine. They've taken a big part of their territory. They've killed, raped, maimed, and done all sorts of other terrible things. And now Russia says, we want a negotiation in which you capitulate completely. And that's just not a negotiation. And so that's complete and utter nonsense. The idea that Ukraine should negotiate on Russia's terms is not a negotiation. We shouldn't push them in any direction towards that. I think we should be pushing Russia to say, you're losing this war, you're being humiliated. The negotiation should be on the following terms. If you're ready to negotiate on the terms of a total withdrawal on reparations, then there's a negotiation to be had. Otherwise, this talk of negotiation is really a talk about entrenching Putin's position where he stands right now.
What do you think is happening in Russia right now? Russia has lost Europe as an energy market, financial pressures because of sanctions, I guess technology pressures within the country. What do you think is happening there right now?
Putin has set Russia back by 3 decades, economically, culturally, internationally. it takes years and years and years to build up an export market for gas, which is one of their only major export products. And they've cut off the gas to Europe. Europe has said, this is strategic, we need this for survival. We're going to find alternatives. And so Europe is never going to come back to Russia for their gas, and that makes up 25% of Russia's government budget. On top of that, 1,000 Western companies have pulled out, that they're not coming back anytime soon. And perhaps most importantly for the Russians themselves, the most able individuals in the country have all fled. Either fled at the very beginning of the war because they didn't want to be part of this, or fled after the conscription. Somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million, highly talented males have left the country. And then there's another million or so, God knows how many, who are being killed on the front line. And so this is a terrible tragedy for everything going on in Russia.
However, Russia continues to find buyers of its oil and gas in China and India. Those customers continue to support and help finance Russia's war on Ukraine.
Yeah, this is the elephant in the room. And so you have Russia earning $1 billion a day on the sale of oil and gas, and you have Russia spending $1 billion a day killing Ukrainians. And Putin can literally conduct this war into perpetuity if we can't find a way to constrain their financial ability to do so.
You say into perpetuity. Russia seems determined to beat down Ukraine to the point where it has little to no value. So I'm just wondering whether this narrative of NATO and belonging to NATO, Ukraine belonging to NATO, is still I guess a dominant narrative.
Well, so this whole thing that Putin has done this because he was afraid of NATO is a complete red herring. It's a nonsense. The reason why Putin is at war is because he's a dictator who is afraid that at some point he was going to lose power, and if he loses power, he'd go to jail and die. That's his fear. And what does a dictator do when he's afraid of losing power? You find a foreign enemy, you start a war, and you whip everyone up into a nationalist fervor. That's why he started this war. The end game for Putin is not neutralizing NATO or creating a Russian empire. This war is only about this little man, this thief, who's stolen an enormous amount of money from this country and is afraid of those people eventually kicking him out. And so he wants to stay in power. It's a desperate ploy for Putin to stay in power. And therefore, there's no way that he's going to do any type of compromising in any way, shape, or form. He can only push forward, he can only escalate. And so anyone who's got a fantasy that this war is going to end through some type of diplomatic negotiation is sorely mistaken. This war is going to end one of two ways. Either Russia wins, and if they do win and take over Ukraine, they'll next be at the Estonian border, and they'll be pointing their guns at a NATO ally, and then we have to then decide, do we want to be at war with Russia? The other alternative is that Ukraine wins, and that's what we have to fight for with everything we've got, and that's why any of this talk about withdrawing aid for Ukraine means that we're just prolonging something which is going to escalate into a much bigger conflict.
What does Russia look like post-conflict, post-Vladimir Putin?
Well, it all depends on how long this conflict goes on for. Putin is hollowing out his country. He's losing his most capable people. He's destroying his infrastructure, he's destroying his military capacity, he's destroying his ability to generate income from the sale of gas to Europe. Russia is going to be a shadow of its former self. And if, in some hopeful scenario, the Putin regime crumbles and you end up with a reasonable person in charge, it's going to take them decades to rebuild it into a normal sort of member of the civilized global world.
When this war in Ukraine began, February 24th, there was a lot of talk of war crimes and war criminals. Where does that stand right now?
Well, all it stands is that whatever talk there was then is now exponentially greater. The targeting of civilians, the raping of women, the torturing of prisoners, the bombing of innocent civilians, the destruction of civilian infrastructure. All these are war crimes. They've all been documented. The people who have committed them will have to face justice.